Just a nurse. That's what Dr. Sterling said when she asked about the billing codes. 3 words, delivered while signing charts at the nurse's station, his voice pitched just loud enough for the day's shift to hear. Just a nurse. As if her hands hadn't held a patient's intestines together during a 32-minute transport from a multi-vehicle pileup on IE-10. As if she hadn't called out a sepsis diagnosis 48 hours before the cultures came back positive. As if she hadn't memorized every medication interaction, every contraindication, every reason why the codes on trauma cases in February didn't match the clinical documentation. But the room had gone quiet at his tone, that particular flavor of dismissal that made it clear questions were unwelcome, especially from someone who signed her paychecks by a different name than the one that used to appear on commendation letters. She had looked back at her work and said nothing. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like insects caught in amber. That silence was a choice. That silence was survival. Laura Bennett had perfected the art of invisible. 3 years at Mercy General in Houston, 3 years of eating lunch alone in the supply closet on the 3rd floor where the old syringes got stacked, where nobody with an MD or administrative authority had reason to venture. She'd chosen the closet deliberately, not because she wanted to be alone, but because alone meant nobody would ask questions about the slight limp on her left side, the one that showed up on long shifts when the nerve damage from a mortar round in Tikrit decided to remind her it existed. Alone meant nobody noticed the way her jaw tightened during code blues, as if she was holding back something dangerous, something that wanted to take over entirely. Alone meant she could eat her turkey sandwich and stare at her hands, scarred across the knuckles, the left index finger missing half its nail from a shrapnel hit she'd never had fully treated, without someone asking her about it. The scrubs she wore were plain blue, generic, purchased in bulk from an online vendor that shipped them in unmarked packaging. Her badge photo had been taken on a day when she'd made sure to look tired. Her hair, naturally dark and thick, she wore pulled back so tight it practically erased her face. She moved through the corridors of Mercy General with the practiced choreography of someone trying not to be seen, shoulders slightly forward, eyes down during shift changes, her voice calibrated to that frequency that nurses learned, low enough to be professional, high enough not to draw attention. She had chosen a hospital in the medical center of a sprawling city specifically because sprawling meant anonymity. Houston was the kind of place where a single woman working nights could rent a small apartment, pay her bills on a nurse's salary, and disappear into the crowd. That had been the entire plan. But bodies remember what minds try to forget. During a trauma admission on a Tuesday morning in February, a recovering Army medic named Jake Hoskins came in with a tension pneumothorax and a blood pressure that was dropping faster than an elevator with a cut cable. The attending physician, not Sterling, thank God, had frozen for the critical moment, that pause that cost lives. Laura had watched from the trauma bay entrance, and her hands had already moved before her brain caught up. 12 years. 18 combat deployments. 243 emergency procedures performed under fire, in trucks, in bunkers, in the dark with nothing but a red-lensed flashlight and hands that knew exactly what to do. The muscle memory in her fingers had never actually gone away, no matter how hard she tried to bury it. She had crossed the bay, her limp barely visible when she walked fast, and performed a 3-finger larynx sweep, the advanced airway maneuver that took most standard nurses 2 years of practice to master, if they ever mastered it at all. Her fingers had found the cricoid cartilage with the kind of precision that made the air in the room change. The trachea had seated. The ventilator had hissed to life. O2 sat climbing from 68 to 75 to 82 to 90. The attending had stared at her like she'd just rebuilt the engine in his car without asking permission. A visiting physician from Dallas, some surgery fellow named Mitchell who'd been observing rounds, had narrowed his eyes, watching her hands, watching her stance, watching the way she'd checked the tube placement with the kind of authority that didn't usually come from someone making $48,000 a year with a 2-year degree. He'd asked her name. She'd told him. He'd asked about her background. She'd said, nursing school at Houston Community College, 6 years ago, and it was technically true, just not the entire truth. The part where she'd had that plus 12 years of advanced trauma medicine training at Bragg was not something that needed volunteering. But she'd seen his eyes narrow further. She'd seen him make a mental note. That evening, Dr. Sterling had come into the supply closet where she was restocking gauze packets. Not her supply closet, he didn't know about her supply closet, her sacred space, her 30 minutes of lunch where she could exist without performing gratitude or deference. He'd been looking for sterile dressings. She'd pointed to the second shelf. He'd nodded, then stopped, then turned back. "You worked Trauma 3 this morning," he'd said. Not a question. A statement. His shoes, Italian leather, definitely expensive, the kind that cost more than her monthly electric bill, had clicked against the tile floor as he'd shifted his weight. Click! Click! The sound of privilege learning how to walk in rooms where it wasn't automatically guaranteed welcome. "Yes, doctor," she'd said. Simple. Deferential. Just a nurse looking for somewhere to be useful. "Interesting technique," he'd said. "Where did you train?" "Houston Community College, like I said. They emphasize hands-on practice." He'd smiled. Not a warm smile. The kind of smile that showed teeth without suggesting friendship. Most nurses from community colleges don't perform airway management that smoothly. Most don't even attempt it. His phone had buzzed. He'd glanced at it. She'd caught a glimpse of a photo on his lock screen, a board meeting, several men in suits around a table, and he'd shoved the phone back in his pocket. The trauma cases from February. The multi-vehicle accident and the industrial accident with the fall. You flagged those billing codes as potentially inflated, correct? Her hands had stopped moving. That was information she'd reported through the proper channels, submitted to the compliance office, as required by law when codes didn't match clinical justification. That was a protected action, legally speaking. Whistleblower protection stuff. But Sterling was asking the question with a tone that suggested he already knew the answer, and that knowing it had made some calculation happen behind his eyes. The codes didn't match the documented procedures, she'd said carefully. The February 14th case was billed as a 6-hour trauma surgery, but the surgical notes only documented 2 hours of OR time. The February 18th case was coded for a Level 5 emergency admission, but the patient presented with a Level 3 injury. I flagged both. To compliance. Yes, doctor. And you didn't think to mention it to me? I oversee billing compliance for the trauma department. That was technically true, though his oversight seemed to focus more on making sure the codes maximized revenue rather than matched reality. She'd seen his email signature on several of the billing notices that seemed designed to ensure that higher codes got approved and lower codes got challenged. But she kept her voice neutral, her eyes down, her shoulders in that small forward hunch that nurses learned, the one that said, "I'm not a threat, I'm just here to help, please don't direct your frustration at me." "I followed protocol, doctor." He'd nodded, slowly, and she'd felt his attention on her the way you feel a thermal imaging camera scanning your position. Not hostile, exactly. Just calculating. "Your name's Bennett, right?" "Yes, doctor." "How long have you worked here, Bennett?" 3 years this May." "And before that?" "Various nursing positions. I moved around." He'd pulled a pack of sterile gloves from the shelf, not the ones he'd come for, she'd noticed, and held them in his hand without opening them. "I'm going to look into your background a little more," he'd said. The tone was friendly, but something underneath it had sharpened. "For compliance purposes. Just want to make sure all our staff is properly vetted. Nothing personal." She'd nodded. One measured breath. The kind of breath she'd learned in a place where panic got you killed. "Of course, doctor." After he'd left, she'd sat down on the floor, right there between the stack of trauma shears and the boxes of gauze, and had not trembled. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. It was 23 years of discipline learning that the moment you let your composure crack, someone with authority and patience would keep pushing until you broke completely. She'd pulled her phone from her scrub pocket and looked at the background photo, a simple landscape, mountain somewhere generic. Her lock screen didn't have names. No dates. No evidence that she'd ever been anything other than what she appeared to be right now, just a nurse, tired, underpaid, invisible. But in her locker upstairs, behind the spare scrubs and the extra socks, wrapped in a grocery bag that hadn't held groceries in 3 years, were a pair of combat boots. Worn leather, the soles cracked from deserts and forward operating bases, the laces made from paracord, the inside still faintly marked with salt stains from sweat and sand. Tikrit sand. It never quite came out. She'd tried. 1 week after medical discharge, she'd taken a brush to them, and the memories had come up with the sand, bright, sharp, unstoppable, and she'd wrapped them in the bag and hidden them the way you hide evidence of something you're trying to forget. Except she hadn't forgotten. The hands that had saved Jake Hoskins this morning had known, without thinking, exactly where his cricoid cartilage was. The eyes that stayed down during rounds could still track a room with the precision of someone trained to anticipate threats. The body that moved invisibly through hospital corridors had once moved across mountains carrying things that weighed everything. She'd finished her shift at midnight, and she hadn't gone to her apartment. She'd gone to her car and sat in the parking lot with her hands on the steering wheel, watching the hospital lights reflect in the rain that had started to fall. 3 years of careful planning, of choosing a name that was real but unused, of building a history that was boring enough to be true. 3 years of eating lunch alone so nobody would discover that the shy nurse in the supply closet had once been something entirely different. And now Sterling was going to look into her background. Now Sterling was going to start asking questions that had very specific answers attached to them, answers that didn't exist in any database that someone searching would expect to find. The rain hammered the parking lot like applause for a performance that had just ended. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like insects trapped in glass as Laura pushed her cart through the corridor at 6:24 a.m. Mercy General's morning shift had begun its choreography, nurses moving between rooms, the ventilators whispering their mechanical rhythm, monitors beeping their steady electronic pulse. She'd arrived early as always, her badge clipped to her scrubs, her combat boots laced tight in her locker downstairs where they belonged. Hidden. Safe. Unremarkable. Dr. Sterling was waiting in the nurse's station when she logged in. He didn't look up from the desk, just let his voice carry across the floor loud enough for everyone to hear, loud enough for the incoming day shift to catch every word like a net. Laura, sweetheart, when you get a moment between naps, there's a bedpan situation in 412 that's more your speed than actual medicine. His smile was the kind that predators wear, all teeth, no warmth. 2 other nurses pretended not to listen. One stared deliberately at her computer screen. Laura took one measured breath. Her jaw tightened, just barely, a hairline fracture in composure that only showed if you knew where to look. She didn't look up from her chart. I'll handle it right after I correct the medication error you just wrote for the patient in 408, doctor. The room went dead silent. His face flushed, a deep crimson that started at his neck and climbed toward his hairline. He walked away without responding, his shoes clicking hard against the tile floor, each footstep a small percussion of rage. She'd heard him make the call that same afternoon, yes, I need you to pull her personnel file. Every reference. Every previous employer. Find me something I can use. 2 days later, the cafeteria at 11:43 a.m. was packed. The day shift came in waves, nurses, residents, respiratory therapists, phlebotomists, the entire machinery of a level 1 trauma center on its lunch break. Laura sat alone at a corner table with a tray holding soup, crackers, and black coffee. She wasn't trying to be alone. She simply was. Dr. Sterling appeared carrying his own tray like a predator moving toward wounded prey. He didn't sit. He stopped at her table and pulled out his wallet with theatrical precision, his voice rising to fill the cafeteria the way a fog fills a valley, inevitable and total. $20 says little Laura here quits before Friday, he announced to the room. Anyone want to take that action? No? Didn't think so. He reached across her table. His hand moved toward her tray with the kind of deliberate slowness that made his intentions unmistakable. Laura watched it happen as if it were occurring to someone else entirely. The tray lifted. The coffee cup tipped. The bowl of soup slid across the plastic surface like something drowning. Everything fell at once, the sound of ceramic shattering on tile, soup spreading across the floor in a rust-colored bloom, crackers scattering like shrapnel. The cafeteria froze. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Forks paused halfway to mouths. 200 people watched what happened next as if it were being filmed in slow motion, as if the moment itself had weight and gravity and the kind of significance that gets remembered for years. Laura looked at the mess on the floor. She looked at her hands, which were steady as surgical steel. She looked at him. A single tear escaped her left eye, not from fear, not from breaking, but from something deeper, some ancient well of restraint that had been dammed up for 3 years. She wiped it away slowly, deliberately, without breaking eye contact. Her voice, when she spoke, was the kind of quiet that cuts through noise like a scalpel through skin. "I've survived worse than you, Doctor." She knelt and began picking up the pieces. Ceramic shards first, cupped carefully in her palm. Then the crackers, soggy now and worthless, dropped into a napkin. Then the bowl itself, which hadn't shattered but had cracked down one side in a jagged line. Her movements were unhurried. Precise. There was no trembling in her hands. There was no wavering in her breath. She picked up every piece like she had all the time in the world, like she wasn't being watched by every single person in that cafeteria, like she wasn't being dismantled in real time by a man whose power derived entirely from his institutional position and his willingness to abuse it. Dr. Sterling laughed. The sound was hollow, unsatisfying, a laugh that expected an audience and found instead something far more dangerous than defiance. He found indifference. She didn't look at him as she stood. She didn't acknowledge the laugh. She simply disposed of the debris, left the tray where it was, and walked out of the cafeteria with her head level and her composure intact. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that he'd already made the call to his brother-in-law 2 days earlier, already set the machinery in motion, already begun the process that would end not with her quitting but with something far more deliberate and calculated. Over the next 2 weeks, Dr. Sterling built his case with the precision of someone constructing a legal argument. Laura arrived at 6:58 a.m. for her 7:13 a.m. shift. He documented her as tardy at 7:02 a.m., his signature sharp and certain on the report. She charted a medication at 14:07 for a dose scheduled at 2 p.m. He flagged it as a 7-minute delay, a potential patient safety issue, a mark against her competence. He pulled her into his office with HR present, with his brother-in-law Gerald Sterling on speakerphone from somewhere in the hospital's administrative floors, the voice thin and crackling but undeniably present, undeniably powerful. "We have documentation here," Dr. Sterling said, spreading papers across his desk like evidence in a trial. Tardiness records. Charting errors. A pattern that stretched back 6 weeks, a constellation of minor infractions that, when arranged together in the proper light, looked like incompetence. Laura sat with her hands folded in her lap. She didn't speak. Her composure was absolute, not the composure of someone broken, but the composure of someone who had been broken before and knew exactly how to survive it. She listened to the accusations without interruption. She watched Dr. Sterling's face as he presented the documentation, watched him look for a crack in her facade, watched him fail to find one. When he finished, she said only, "I'd like union representation before we continue." That afternoon, she was back on the floor, back in the trauma bays, back doing the work that had defined the last 3 years of her life, invisible, unremarkable, a ghost moving through the hospital's corridors. But something had shifted. The fabrication process had accelerated something in her, some recognition that the situation was no longer about professional conflict or personality clash. This was institutional. This was orchestrated. She'd started noticing things. Small inconsistencies in the billing codes for trauma cases. Procedure charges that didn't align with the injuries treated. Insurance claims for equipment that was never used, for consultations that happened too quickly to be real. On Tuesday morning at 9:15 a.m., she pulled up the records for a motorcycle accident victim from the previous week, severe lacerations requiring 847 stitches, 3 units of blood, 2 hours in the OR. The billing showed charges for equipment that didn't match the injury profile, codes that suggested interventions that never happened. She mentioned it once to the billing department, a woman named Sandra who went pale the moment the question left Laura's mouth and changed the subject with a kind of finality that suggested someone had already warned her never to have this conversation. That same afternoon, Dr. Sterling received a call from his brother-in-law. His office door was closed, but voices carried through hospital walls like rumors through hallways. "We have a problem. That nurse is asking questions about the Medicaid trauma codes." That evening, when Laura went to her locker to retrieve her street clothes, something was wrong. The lock was different, a new combination lock, chrome and gleaming and unfamiliar. Security said it was routine maintenance, just rotating out the old locks, nothing to worry about. When they finally opened it for her, her boots were sitting on top of her street clothes. Someone had moved them. Someone had been inside her locker, had handled the one object she'd kept from Tikrit, had sent a message so clear it didn't require words. She clutched the boots to her chest and said nothing. Her face remained steady. Her breathing remained controlled. But something in her recognition of the moment was absolute. This wasn't about billing codes anymore. This wasn't about professional disagreement or personality conflict. This was about survival, and she had survived far worse than institutional power plays. She had survived the kind of things that exist in medical textbooks only as case studies and in military reports only as redacted paragraphs. She had survived weapons and heat and blood and the kind of loss that rewrites a person's entire internal architecture. Dr. Sterling had no idea who he was standing next to. He had no idea what he was about to trigger. The multi-vehicle collision came through the ER doors at 3:56 p.m. like a storm surge. 3 cars. 7 patients. The overhead intercom crackled with controlled urgency, trauma alert, all bays. Multiple vehicle accident, I-10 eastbound at Fannin. Paramedics wheeled stretchers through the sliding doors with the synchronized precision of a choreographed disaster. Broken limbs. Head lacerations. One patient with a pneumothorax that was collapsing faster than anyone wanted to admit. Laura was already moving, already reading vitals off the overhead monitors before the stretchers locked into place. Her hands didn't shake. Her breathing didn't quicken. This was the part of nursing that made sense, the part where chaos resolved into sequence, where panic became protocol. The attending surgeon was in the OR. Both residents were deep in other bays. That left Laura with 1 paramedic, 3 nurses still in triage, and a bay full of patients who needed decisions made right now. She moved to Bay 6 where a construction worker lay gasping, his airway compromised, blood pooling in his throat with every labored breath. The monitor beeped like a warning nobody heeded except her. Oxygen saturation dropping. 94, 88. 82, his eyes were wide with the animal panic of suffocation. Laura didn't hesitate. She prepped the tracheotomy kit with hands that moved like they'd done this 1,000 times before, because they had, just not in Houston. Not in a hospital. Not under fluorescent lights that hummed with the sound of institutional safety. The scalpel felt right in her grip. The 14-gauge angiocath needle felt like an extension of her own skeleton. She positioned the patient's neck with the kind of anatomical certainty that came from understanding not just textbooks but survival. Her gloved fingers located the cricothyroid membrane with textbook precision, that thin membrane between the cartilage rings where the airway opened up if you knew exactly where to press. The 3-finger larynx sweep, index and middle finger holding the vocal cords open, thumb applying gentle pressure to the larynx itself, was not standard civilian protocol. It was combat medicine. It was what you did when you had 30 seconds before hemorrhagic shock made the whole question moot. It was what they taught at Fort Bragg to medics who might never see a hospital again. She made the incision. Smooth. Controlled. The rush of air was almost obscene in its relief. Oxygen saturation climbed. 85, 90. 96, sinus rhythm held. Breathing stabilized. The patient gasped once, twice, then regular respirations returned like a prayer answered. In Bay 7, separated only by a curtain partition, Jake Hoskins watched the whole thing. He was a recovering Army medic himself, broken left femur from an IED 3 weeks ago, high on painkillers and dehydration, but conscious enough to see her hands work. Conscious enough to recognize what he was watching. His eyes went wide. Not from pain. From recognition. From the specific knowledge that only someone trained in military medicine could perform exactly what he'd just witnessed. The pause was barely a second. Then, his voice came through the curtain gap, rough and astonished. "You trained at Bragg. That's not standard civilian protocol. That's combat medicine." "Who are you?" Laura froze. Her gloved hand still held the trach tube. Her jaw tightened, a single micro-muscle contraction that she suppressed immediately, but it was there. The question hung in the air between them like a live wire. She couldn't deny it. The sweep was too specific. The confidence was too evident. The speed was too practiced. Everything about what she'd just done screamed military trauma surgeon, not hospital nurse. She opened her mouth to respond, some lie, some deflection, some way to stitch her cover back together before it came completely unraveled. She never got the words out. The bay doors swung open hard enough to make the metal rattle against its frame. Dr. Sterling appeared with 2 security guards flanking him like subordinates in his personal army. His face was already arranged into an expression of professional concern, the kind of mask that only worked if you'd never actually cared about anything except power. "Step away from the patient, Laura. Now." It wasn't a request. It was delivered like a command, voice flat, eyes cold. She didn't move. Her hands stayed exactly where they were. "He'll die if I said step away. You're not authorized for surgical procedures. This is exactly the kind of reckless behavior we've documented." Sterling's voice had the texture of someone who'd already won the argument before he asked the question. He'd prepared for this. He'd been waiting for her to slip. And she had. Not with the billing codes. Not with her quiet competence. But with her hands. With her muscle memory. With the one thing she couldn't hide when a patient's oxygen saturation was dropping toward unconsciousness. He moved in to take over the trach tube, his own hand still trembling slightly from the adrenaline hit of catching her. He fumbled with the tube placement. His fingers weren't steady. This was a man who knew how to manage billing fraud and public humiliation, not someone who'd spent years in operating theaters where hesitation killed people. Jake Hoskins was shouting from Bay 7, "She just saved my life. What are you doing?" But the doors were already closing behind her. Security had hands on her upper arms, not rough, not violent, but absolutely firm. Professional. This wasn't her first removal from a workplace. But it felt different this time. It felt final. They walked her through the hallway with the kind of quiet efficiency that made other staff members lower their eyes. Nobody looked at her. Nobody made eye contact. That was the protocol for removed employees. Acknowledge them and you might be next. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like insects commenting on her humiliation. Her wet scrubs clung to her skin, cooling rapidly in the hospital's aggressive air conditioning. The walk to HR took 45 seconds. She counted them out of habit. HR was already waiting. Dr. Sterling's brother-in-law was on speakerphone, his voice carrying that particular tone of someone who'd already consulted with a lawyer and found everything airtight. The termination was delivered like a script. Repeated failure to follow hospital protocols. Dangerous improvisational behavior. Insubordination in front of attending physicians. Practicing medicine without a license. Every charge was technically true and completely false at the same time. They handed her a cardboard box. The same one they always used. About 18 inches square. Industrial tape securing the bottom. She packed her locker contents into it with mechanical precision. Her extra scrubs. A photograph she kept of her unit at Camp Lejeune, faces blurred in case anyone ever asked questions. Her personal items from the shelf. And finally, carefully, the grocery bag containing her combat boots. The ones with the scuff marks from desert sand that wouldn't quite wash out. The ones that had walked through Tikrit in 2009 carrying 3/4 of a ton of combat experience. She was no longer allowed to exist within this building. Security walked her to the employee exit at 4:22 p.m. 35 minutes from the multi-vehicle collision to removal. 35 minutes from saving a life to losing her job. Standing on the far side of the glass doors, Dr. Sterling watched from the second-floor window overlooking the parking lot. His phone was pressed to his ear. His smile was the smile of someone who'd just eliminated a problem before it could grow into a threat. Laura didn't look back. She walked through the sliding doors into the Houston afternoon, temperature already dropping toward evening, that particular kind of humid heat that made the air feel thick as water. The box was heavy. Heavier than it should have been for what was in it. Her hands, the same hands that had just performed a 3-finger larynx sweep, that had positioned an airway with military precision, that had saved a recovering army medic's life, now carried a cardboard box containing the visible evidence of her invisibility. The combat boots in the grocery bag swung against her leg with each step. She walked for blocks before she realized where her feet were taking her. The parking lot of the veteran cemetery was empty. Rain had started falling, the kind of afternoon rain that came without warning in Houston, that soaked everything in seconds and felt like the city crying on your behalf. The cardboard box grew heavier with each block. Laura's arms ached, but not the way they used to ache after 18-hour trauma shifts. This was different. This was the ache of ending. The worn combat boots shifted inside the grocery bag, Tikrit dust still embedded in the seams after 3 years of hiding them in her locker, wrapped in an old uniform she'd never dared unfold. For blocks from the employee exit, the sun hammering down on Houston streets like an interrogation lamp, she made a decision her body had already made for her. Left turn. Toward the cemetery. The veteran cemetery sat on 32 acres of oak and limestone on the city's east side. She'd driven past it 100 times without stopping. Today she drove past nothing, because today she was walking, because that was all she could do. The gates hung open. A few scattered headstones caught the afternoon light like broken teeth. The sky had started to darken without warning, that Houston kind of darkness that comes from nothing and everywhere at once. By the time she reached the grave in the northwest corner, the first drops were falling. Marcus James Bennett. 2nd Lieutenant, Naval Special Warfare Group 3. December 14, 1978 to March 3, 2011. Killed in action, Helmand Province, Afghanistan. The epitaph read what they always read: beloved husband. Devoted son. Hero. None of it captured him. Laura knelt in the grass without thinking about whether the ground was wet. It was. The rain started falling harder, not the gentle kind, but the kind that came like a verdict. She held the box against her chest, then set it down because her hands needed to shake and the box was in the way. The grocery bag slipped from her fingers. The combat boots fell into the grass beside the grave marker. She stared at them as if they belonged to someone else, some other Laura who knew how to be strong without breaking, who knew how to survive without disappearing. I failed, Marcus. Her voice sounded wrong out loud. Cracked. It had been 3 years since she'd spoken to him like this, and 3 years of not speaking meant 3 years of the words building pressure like a tension pneumothorax, like air in the chest with nowhere to escape. I can't even hold a simple nursing job. For months. For months, and I let one doctor, one mediocre, terrified man, end everything I built. The rain soaked through her scrubs. Her hair plastered itself to her neck. I thought I was being smart. I thought walking away from the Navy, choosing anonymity, choosing to heal quietly without the rank, without the call sign, without anyone knowing who I was, I thought that was strength. But it was cowardice, Marcus. It was just hiding. And today the hiding stopped working. She pressed her forehead against the wet grass. The earth smelled like clay and petrichor and the specific loneliness of a cemetery in the rain. Her hands moved to the boots, still laced, still ready, as if she'd only taken them off an hour ago instead of 3 years. The PTSD won today. I let it win. Some captain in a tailored suit knocked my tray on the floor in front of everyone and I just stood there. I just took it. Senior Chief Petty Officer Laura Bennett, callsign Ghostwriter, 14 combat deployments, and I took a psychological crucifixion from a man whose biggest trauma was probably not getting the right shade of mahogany in his office. Her voice broke on the words. Actual tears now, mixing with the rain so completely she couldn't separate them. I should have stayed. I should have fought. I should have told someone where I was. But I was so tired of being needed, Marcus. So tired of people's lives depending on whether I could think clearly under fire. So I chose you instead. She meant she chose memory of him, chose the version of Marcus that existed only in the quiet of her apartment, chose invisibility in his name. And look where that got me. Fired. Invisible in the worst way. Not invisible because I'm skilled enough to be forgotten, but invisible because I'm so scared of being found that I made myself disappear. She sobs came then, genuine, shoulder-shaking, the kind she would never permit herself in any other location on Earth. This grave, this specific rectangle of Houston Earth, was the only place where Senior Chief Petty Officer Laura Bennett was allowed to break. The rain continued. She stayed there for 20 minutes, kneeling, letting the weather do what she wouldn't permit anyone living to witness. When she stood, her legs trembled from cold and something else, the specific trembling that comes from releasing pressure that has built for years. She wiped her face with the back of her hand, a gesture so controlled and methodical that even grief couldn't disrupt her training. The boots went back into the grocery bag. The box got lifted again. She turned from the grave and walked back toward the cemetery gates, her scrubs clinging to her skin like a second suit of failure. The sidewalk outside was empty. One car passed, a gray sedan that didn't slow. Houston stretched around her like a city that had learned not to look too closely at people falling apart in public. 2 miles from the hospital. No destination. Just forward, because backward was impossible and standing still was not an option her nervous system understood. The rain continued. The box continued growing heavier. And then the sound changed. It started as a vibration in her chest, low and primal, the kind of frequency that bypassed her ears and spoke directly to the ancient part of her brain that remembered the sound of salvation. Thud 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 thud. Rotor wash. Laura stopped walking. She looked up toward the gray sky and saw them, 2 Blackhawks descending through the rain clouds like landing planets, like the sky tearing open, like everything that had been impossible a moment ago suddenly reorganizing itself around a single word, inbound. The Blackhawks settled into an empty parking lot 50 yards ahead, their rotor wash scattering rainwater and debris in a perfect circle. Neither aircraft had markings visible from the ground. Both had cargo doors already sliding open before the landing skids touched asphalt. Soldiers in tactical gear, the kind that came from units that didn't appear on org charts, began moving with the specific precision of operators who had done this in weather far worse than Houston rain. A Special Forces lieutenant with the bearing of someone accustomed to commanding rooms jumped from the port Blackhawk and ran toward her. His uniform bore no unit patch. His face was young and hard and entirely focused on her. He was shouting something, but the rotor noise swallowed it. He covered the 50 yards between them in 12 seconds, boots splashing, his presence moving the air like a knife through water. Senior Chief Bennett, he was shouting, and the words hit her like a physical thing. Senior Chief Petty Officer Laura Bennett. She stood frozen. The box hung from her arms like it weighed nothing. The grocery bag with the boots pressed against her chest. Around them the rain fell and the Blackhawks churned the air and the city continued not looking directly at the impossible thing occurring on one of its sidewalks. "We have a critical patient inbound to Mercy General," the lieutenant continued, moving closer, his voice cutting through the rotor noise the way trained military voices could cut through anything. "Tension pneumothorax mid-flight. The general is asking for you by name." Time did something strange. It both accelerated and stopped. Laura felt the recognition hit her system like a drug, the specific drug that came from being found after 3 years of hiding. The box dropped to the sidewalk. The grocery bag with the boots fell beside it. Her scrubs were already soaked. Her hands were already moving. The training that lived in her muscles deeper than memory took over. She ran toward the Black Hawk. 23 seconds from standing on the sidewalk to being in the cargo bay of a UH-60M Blackhawk. Her brain registered details with the precision of someone processing combat information. The general was grey-faced, asymmetrical chest movement, the left side not rising with each breath, oxygen saturation probably dropping by the second. A needle decompression kit was already in a trauma tech's hands. The aircraft was banking hard toward the southeast, toward Mercy General, toward the place she'd walked away from an hour ago, toward whatever came next. The general's eyes found hers as she knelt beside the stretcher. He was trying to speak but couldn't because his left lung was collapsing and there was nothing but trapped air where air should move freely. She didn't introduce herself. She didn't explain. She just moved with the fluidity of someone doing something she'd done 100 times before. 14 intercostal space. Midclavicular line. The catheter was in her hands. The angle was perfect. She found the spot, felt the familiar anatomy through her fingertips, and inserted the needle with the specific pressure that came from muscle memory living deeper than consciousness. The hiss of air escaping. That was the sound she'd been waiting to hear for 3 years. The general's chest expanded. Color returned to his face like someone turning up a dimmer switch. His oxygen saturation began climbing, 76, 82, 88, stabilizing at 94%. His hand, trembling and alive, gripped her wrist with the strength of someone being pulled back from the edge of a cliff. He looked directly into her eyes and spoke a single word, gravelly and urgent and filled with 3 years of waiting, "Ghostwriter." The rotor wash shook the entire helicopter, and the lieutenant's voice cut through the noise with the precision of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Senior Chief Bennett, we have a critical patient inbound to Mercy General and the general is asking for you by name." The words landed like defibrillator paddles. Not a request. Not a courtesy. A summons issued in the language of command. Laura didn't think. She dropped the cardboard box, 3 years of anonymity hitting the pavement, and ran toward the open cargo door, her borrowed grocery bag with the combat boots clutched against her chest like a flag. The general lay on the tactical stretcher, his chest heaving in the irregular rhythm of a man drowning from the inside. Tension pneumothorax. A collapsed lung pressing against his heart, suffocating him one breath at a time. His skin was the color of old drywall, his lips already taking on the faint blue of hypoxia. The SEAL combat medic beside him looked up with the expression of someone watching a drowning man search for a rope they couldn't reach. "Senior Chief, we've got no needle, no equipment, but Laura was already moving, and muscle memory took over. Her hands moved on their own. She knelt beside him, found the second intercostal space with her fingers, midclavicular line. 18 millimeters down. Anatomy carved into her body from 1,000 training scenarios and 100 real traumas. The helicopter banked hard left, and she braced herself against the turbulence with the calm of someone who had performed medicine under far worse conditions. From the SEAL medic's aid bag, she drew a 14-gauge needle, not ideal. Nothing about this was ideal, and her voice came out steady and low, "Hold him." The combat medic pressed down. Laura's hands found the precise angle, and she drove the needle home. The hiss of air escaping was immediate, violent, urgent. Pneumothorax decompressing. The general's eyes flew open as his lung re-inflated, as oxygen began moving through his passages again instead of poison pressure crushing him toward death. 30 seconds. That's all it took to transform his breathing from the gasps of a dying man into something resembling life. 90 seconds total from the moment she'd stepped into the helicopter, and the general's color was already returning, the gray retreating from his face like a tide going out. His hand found her wrist. Gripped it with the strength of someone pulling himself back from the edge. His voice came out rough, fractured, weighted with something that sounded like recognition and relief and 3 years of waiting finally over. "Ghostwriter." He spoke her old call sign like a prayer, like the name of someone he'd thought was lost, and in that single word, in that voice that had commanded her through firefights in Tikrit, the last thread of her disguise severed. She was no longer just a nurse. The identity she'd buried was walking out into daylight, and everyone on that helicopter knew it now. The Blackhawks descended toward Mercy General's helipad like judgment itself, rotors thrashing the morning air into submission. Laura stayed beside the general's stretcher, one hand on his shoulder, as the aircraft touched down. Through the cargo doors opening, she could see them waiting, Dr. Sterling standing with the hospital administration, their faces arranged in the careful expression of people expecting routine. The CEO was already moving forward, already reaching for the general's stretcher with the automatic courtesy reserved for power. Then the doors opened fully, and everything changed. A woman in navy dress blues descended first, lieutenant's insignia sharp on her uniform, her bearing military precise and her face arranged in something that looked like controlled rage. She was younger than the general, carried his same dark eyes, moved with the same economical authority. His daughter. Behind her came two SEAL team operators in tactical gear, and behind them a man in a dark suit with the unmistakable bearing of federal law enforcement, FBI credentials already visible, already moving with the confidence of a warrant at his back. The woman in navy blue stepped directly into Dr. Sterling's path, and her voice was quiet enough that only the people closest could hear it, but the sound carried the weight of a courtroom verdict. "You just fired Senior Chief Petty Officer Laura Bennett." Dr. Sterling's face did something complex, confusion transitioning to indignation transitioning to something that looked like the first crack in understanding. "I'm not sure what you mean, Lieutenant." There was a performance issue, a staffing, the trauma nurse from the ER pushed through the crowd, the general's chart trembling slightly in her hands. She didn't ask permission. She began reading aloud, her voice shaking, "The only medic who kept me alive in Tikrit, 2009. Bring her home." The words were written in the general's own hand, scratched across the margins of his admission form in a script that looked like it had cost him effort but mattered more than effort. The SEAL team leader stepped forward, his eyes locking onto Dr. Sterling with the expression of someone cataloging a weakness. When he spoke, each word came out individually, deliberately, like rounds fired into still water. "Bronze Star with Valor." He paused. Dr. Sterling said nothing. "Silver Star." Another pause. The CEO's skin had begun to pale. "Two Purple Hearts." The SEAL waited, letting the weight accumulate. "Navy Cross." That last one landed like a fist. 14 combat deployments. 18 years of service. The SEAL's voice dropped lower. "And you threw a chart at her feet." The FBI agent in the suit stepped forward, his credentials already moving across his body in the practiced gesture of someone serving notice. "Special Agent Morris, FBI. I'm here regarding an ongoing investigation into Medicaid fraud and insurance kickback schemes at Mercy General, spanning 18 months and totaling approximately $2.3 million. His eyes moved directly to Dr. Sterling. "Your flag billing audits, Dr. Bennett," he nodded slightly toward Laura, "are what triggered our investigation 8 months ago. Falsified procedure codes. Inflated trauma case billings. Insurance companies in on the scheme." Morris's hand gestured slightly, and FBI agents moved forward with handcuffs. "Gerald Sterling, you have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Dr. Sterling's brother-in-law was already being cuffed, his face gone white with the comprehension of a man watching his career collapse in real time. Sterling himself took one step backward, tried once. "This is a misunderstanding. I was simply maintaining quality standards, ensuring that only the best nurses." The SEAL leader cut him off, his voice like a knife stopping mid-thrust. "You knocked her food to the floor in front of the entire day shift." Sterling's mouth closed. The SEAL continued, his tone absolute. "You made a bet about whether she'd quit. You threw a patient chart at her feet and called her sweetheart. Then you fabricated disciplinary reports to destroy her career because she threatened your theft operation." The hospital CEO turned to Sterling, and her voice came out hollow with realization. "Your hospital privileges are immediately revoked. Security will escort you out." It took a moment for the instruction to land, for Sterling to understand that the conversation wasn't negotiable anymore. He stood frozen, and then he moved, his shoulders collapsing inward like a structure losing its load-bearing walls. The same security guard who had handed Laura her termination box that morning, the one who had avoided her eyes, who had followed Sterling's orders without question, now approached with a second cardboard box. When he spoke, his voice was so quiet it barely registered above the helicopter rotors still winding down. "I believe you know the way out, sir." Sterling took the box with trembling hands. FBI agents flanked him immediately, moving him toward the elevator with the efficient precision of people who had done this many times before. He was escorted past Laura, past the general still breathing steadily on the stretcher, past his own brother-in-law in handcuffs. He didn't look at her. She watched him go without expression, without satisfaction, without the smallest indication of feeling, because what she carried was something deeper than the need to see him destroyed. She carried the knowledge that she had survived worse than this, that she had already won, that his collapse was merely consequence catching up to action. The rain had stopped. Sunlight broke through the departing clouds in long theatrical shafts that illuminated the helipad like a stage. Laura stood in her wet scrubs, and she reached down deliberately and laced her combat boots tight. The knots were steady, her hands moving with the authority of someone reclaiming what had always been hers. The general, stable now and breathing easily on his stretcher, raised one hand in a weak salute. The Navy lieutenant, his daughter, reached over and squeezed Laura's shoulder, and her eyes were full of gratitude that didn't need words. Behind them, the hospital staff who had worked alongside Laura for 3 years stared at her like they had never seen her before, like a ghost had suddenly become solid, like someone they had dismissed had transformed into legend in the space of 90 seconds. A junior Army medic named Jake Hoskins pushed through the crowd on crutches, his face split wide with recognition and something that looked like relief. "I knew it," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I knew those hands had seen combat. Thank you for saving my life, Senior Chief." He saluted her, and the gesture landed with the weight of military tradition, of respect given to respect earned. Laura returned the salute, and for the first time since the helicopters had arrived, something that might have been a smile touched the corners of her mouth. The fluorescent lights of the helipad seemed to hum with finality. 3 years of invisibility, of careful anonymity, of walking through Mercy General with her true identity locked away like contraband, all of it gone in the space of the time it took to decompress a tension pneumothorax and speak a call sign aloud. As the general was wheeled toward surgery and the FBI continued its systematic dismantling of the fraud network that had protected Dr. Sterling, Laura stood very still. The combat boots felt right on her feet. The Navy staff recognized her now, saluted her, addressed her by her rank. The nurses who had pitted the quiet new hire began to understand that they had been working beside someone from a world they didn't have the operational clearance to fully comprehend. The general's voice called out from the stretcher as he was wheeled past, "Welcome home, Senior Chief. Welcome home." And for the first time in 3 years, Laura Bennett believed it. If you love a good underdog story, hit that like button now. Subscribe so you never miss one. And comment below, have you ever been the underdog? Let's see how this plays out.